opportunity to hear from the folks who are in charge of the law enforcement efforts to interdict the supply of heroin coming into this community, and who have done a tremendous job in taking the supply side into account, in assessing it, and in trying to interdict as much of the flow of drugs as can be done. A couple of quick numbers, although I think that you've heard some very interesting ones this morning. I would add to that this statistic: the 450% increase in the heroin overdose death rate in this community between 2010 and 2012. A stunning increase. Our two families that we heard from really bring home in a way that a slide like this cannot the human cost of the deaths that come to us in our community from addiction. But in a graphical form, this represents the 80 people we lost from this community in 2012 due to heroin overdose. Each one of them, someone's family member, someone's precious child. And that knowledge, that insight, is what motivates the work that the folks on this panel and the men and women that they work with do every day. That desire to protect and to serve. A key piece of the fight against heroin is our ability to put in jail the traffickers, the organized groups that bring heroin into our communities. And so the purpose of this panel is for you to hear a bit about how that work is being done and how a community strategy that takes part in both the law enforcement work and the community addiction prevention and treatment modalities can give us the best possible results for the community. So we've got on this panel, and let me pull out my notes for a minute as we get started, Brandon Falls, to my direct left, our district attorney for Jefferson County, who many of you know. Sitting next to Brandon is Chief A.C. Roper, the chief of the Birmingham Police Department. To A.C.'s left is Clay Morris. Clay is in charge of the DEA in this part of Alabama, I guess in all of Alabama, Clay, and has in many ways led the fight against heroin in this community. To Clay's left is Rick Schwein. Rick is the special agent in charge of the FBI in North Alabama. And I think you'll hear during the course of the panel that the partnership of FBI and DEA and their ability to work with their state and local partners is what has really given teeth to the law enforcement efforts. Our final panelist is Sergeant Christopher Anderson with Birmingham Police Department. And I have to apologize to him a little bit for putting him on this panel with his boss. But we were in a meeting together a couple of months ago where we were talking not about heroin, but about violent crime. And his real-world understanding of the problem he was seeing brought home the importance of the work that we're doing. And I wanted you all to have the opportunity to hear that firsthand as we spoke today. So let me start by asking Clay, will you talk with us a little bit about heroin came back into vogue after being a drug that people thought had cycled out of popularity, and what you're seeing today in your work?
Sure. Thank you, Joyce. First, thank you for having us, and thank you for letting DEA be a part of the Heroin Summit. Really, when we started to see a shift in the overdose death rates in the Birmingham area in 2010, really peaking in 2012, when you look at the numbers are staggering. You go from 14 to 80 in a 2-year period. That is a significant increase in the overdose death rate attributed to the use and abuse of heroin. And when you look at heroin from a holistic perspective, when you look at the problem of the addiction of heroin and really how we attack it from a law enforcement perspective, you have to look at several factors, Joyce, that factor into where did we get to the point why heroin has come back. Drugs are cyclical in nature, is one aspect that we have to look at. But there are also some other aspects that are vitally important to understanding where we are today and why our criminal elements in the Birmingham area and really in the northern Alabama as a whole have moved from their traditional drugs of choice from what they have traditionally known to distribute to distributing heroin. And one of the factors is very, very simple. And the first speaker this morning kind of framed that discussion for us of a business model, of a supply and demand effect. Where there's a demand, there will always be a supply. So there's a great demand for heroin in our area. So drug traffickers are smart. They have a business model, and if there's a demand, they will bring the supply. And this morning we talked about commodities. Heroin is their commodity. Now, how did we get to heroin being the commodity? Well, we need to look further, and we need to look at a more holistic approach, and we talked about it again this morning, is the abuse of opioid drugs in our state and in Birmingham. I don't know, I had to step out for one moment this morning, but Alabama is the #2 state in the country for prescriptions of hydrocodone per 100,000 people. Alabama likes to be #1 in football. We do not like to be #1 and known across the country for being the #2 state in the country for hydrocodone prescriptions. When you look at the numbers of prescriptions across our state, the numbers are staggering. Last year, in 2013, we had over 13 million prescriptions written for Schedule 2, 3, and 4 controlled substances, including opioid drugs within our state. Now, if you break that 13 million prescriptions down, that's over 700 million dosage units of controlled substances that were prescribed in the state of Alabama. And this is just one source of supply for pharmaceutical drugs, which is being diverted to the black market. Well, of the 700 million, that equals over 300 million day supply of pharmaceutical drugs if we all needed those. So if you compare those numbers to our population in the state, we have 4.2 million citizens in the state of Alabama. But what makes it even further alarming is not every person in the state of Alabama obtained a prescription last year. Only 2.5 million people got the 13 million prescriptions. So that means if we all got those prescriptions in this room, each one of us got at least 6 prescriptions last year. And that is really the basis of the problem, that the epidemic use and abuse of prescription drugs, of the opioid-based drugs, has brought us to heroin. We call it a cycle of addiction. And we've touched on it this morning, but the cycle of addiction starts with hydrocodone, then we build a tolerance, we move to oxycodone, we build a tolerance, we move to OxyContin, and then we're naturally going to progress to heroin. And that's when the business model of drug trafficking organizations comes into play, because pharmaceutical drugs on the black market are expensive. They're about $1 a milligram. When I can go out and if I know a heroin trafficker in Birmingham, I can buy it for $10 a bundle, and I can get my high immediately. So that really frames the stage of the problem of where we are today and how we got there in very short order. And that's no different than what we're seeing across the country. I think Rick and some others will speak to that. It's not a Birmingham problem. This is a national and transnational problem that we're experiencing. We're just experiencing the real side effects of death in our community.
So, Clay, you anticipated my next question, which is for Rick. And that question is whether the heroin experience in Birmingham is unique. And also, I think it would be interesting to hear you comment on a question I'm often asked by the press, which is, who are the heroin trafficking networks that are bringing heroin into our community?
Yeah, those are great questions. But first of all, let me thank you, Joyce and Clay, with DEA for the leadership that they've taken. Once this problem was identified as being an emerging issue for Birmingham, both DEA and the U.S. Attorney's Office played a key role in coming up with a strategy, right? Because you got to identify the problem, then you have to scope the problem, then you have to sit down with all the stakeholders, state, local, and federal, and come up with a law enforcement solution. And we did that with some impact over the past year. Unfortunately, in my experience, 26 years in the FBI, with drug organizations, or really any criminal organization, you can't arrest your way out of the problem. There are very few things that you can arrest your way out. And drug trafficking is probably, Clay has, he's never going to run out of a job. He's always going to have something to do as a DEA special agent. Unfortunately, the chief's always going to have a job, and the sergeant's always going to have a job, and I'm going to always have a job, and so is the U.S. Attorney's Office. They're always going to have a job. Because whenever there's profit, people are going to find a way to capitalize on weaknesses. The issue here in North Alabama and in Birmingham is the scope, as Clay indicated. So there's a tremendous demand for heroin. And it's a great example of what's old becomes new again, right? It's not just a 70s crime show drug anymore. It's come to this community in a big way, and trafficking organizations understand that. Criminal enterprises understand that. So I'll give you an example here in Birmingham about the time that Joyce and Clay started having these conversations about strategy. Our North Alabama Violent Crime Safe Streets Task Force was investigating a polydrug organization. It was a case called King of the Hill. And this organization, roughly a dozen folks that had been in the Birmingham area for over 20 years as traffickers, had been in and out of the state system, had been involved in numerous violent crime incidents, including up to 12 homicides, to protect their enterprise. They were a polydrug organization. They sold whatever the demand required. So they would sell marijuana, they would sell cocaine, they would sell crack cocaine. And then during the course of this investigation, we saw them shift and start selling heroin. And what surprised us, we were able to take a law enforcement action and interdict one of their couriers and seize 2 kilograms of heroin. And what surprised us was the purity was 95%. We hadn't seen that kind of purity before. And then sitting down with Clay and his people, they were seeing that kind of purity with street dealers, which tells me the market is flooded, right? The traffickers aren't having to cut their product. They're selling it almost in a pure state because they don't need to expand their profit. There's a huge market out there. And these organizations control that market. So the profitability in any criminal enterprise is going to be the driver. And Clay outlined earlier how this cycle has led us to heroin being the drug du jour, the drug of the day. So where does that money go? That goes to transnational criminal enterprises. There aren't poppy fields in and around Birmingham that I'm aware of, are there, Chief? Negative. Right? So where are the poppy fields? South Central America, Golden Triangle of Asia, Central Asia, Afghanistan. So this profit not only goes to criminal organizations, but there's a natural alliance between criminal organizations and terrorist organizations. Because what do terrorist organizations need? They need the way to move money, right, illicitly. They need to illicitly obtain firearms and explosives. They need to move people across international borders. What do criminal enterprises need to do? Same types of things. So there was a popular commercial that came out right after 9/11 that, buy drugs, fund terrorism. I'm not so sure that's the case, right, that you can make that direct link. We have made that direct link in some cases, and certainly there are religious scholars that organizations such as Hezbollah, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda go to, and they've issued fatwas or religious edicts that say it's okay to sell drugs in order to fund violent jihad. And there is that tenuous connection, but money's fungible, right? The money that people spend on illegal drugs goes a lot of different places into the 4 corners of the globe. And in order to fully address those organizations, you've got to turn off that funding mechanism. And we're not going to be able to do that. We can seize a lot of money, we can take assets, and that has a deterrent effect, but typically it just creates a vacuum for another organization to come in and fill. We have short-term effect. The long-term effect needs to be an all-of-community approach, and this, based on the participation, is a great first step.
Thanks, Rick. Chris, can you talk a little bit about the role you're playing for the police department and how you're seeing heroin in that role?
Okay. My team is the crime reduction team. What we do is we target your most violent offenders in Birmingham. Most of your homicides, your assaults, your robbery cases, the arrests that you see in the news are usually made by my team. That's all we do. We don't our job is we have a wonderful narcotics unit, and they're very well trained and drug and making arrests for drugs. So that we don't, narcotics is not what we do. Back when I came to this department about 19 years ago, the drug of choice was crack cocaine. If you were a little bit progressive in your police work, you could pretty much make a crack arrest anytime you wanted to. Fast forward that to 2014. With my team, because of the type of offenders we deal with on a daily basis, they utilize the sale of drugs to that's how they make their money, basically. When we make these arrests, when we go after these offenders, usually we will find drugs. Like I said, back when I first started, crack cocaine was that drug. Now, in the past year, with the arrests that we've made and the narcotics that we've recovered, I've probably seen crack cocaine maybe 3-4 times, and we make probably 5 to 10 narcotics arrests a month. So in my opinion, I can't come up here and give you a bunch of stats or anything like that. That's not what I'm here for. I can tell you what I'm seeing on the streets on a daily basis. These drugs that we're talking about here today, the heroin, is taking the position of what crack was back when I started in 1995.
I think when we were in our meeting, you said that every time you guys went out to make these arrests, you were just falling all over the heroin because that was the drug that was now predominating.
It's pretty much. I mean, you'll occasionally see cocaine, but we're not going out looking for heroin. That's the point I want to make. We're not looking for it. That's not what we've been targeted to do. When we go out and make these drug arrests, we're finding heroin. And it's the majority of the arrests, it's the majority of the times that we're recovering drugs, we're making heroin.
Brandon, what are you seeing in your work as the district attorney? What's the fallout of the resurgence of heroin?
I really first became aware of this a few years ago during a grand jury. I've been in the office 17 years, and there's really only one heroin case that stands out in my mind that I personally handled, and that was at least 10 years ago. And it was a trafficking heroin case. What you see under state law is you have possession, then you have distribution, which is sale, and you have trafficking, which can be sale or possession, but of a much larger amount. So I can recall one trial with a trafficking defendant, and comparing that to now, she must have been the source for the entire Jefferson County area. Now go forward to 2011. On one grand jury, I saw 11 heroin possession cases on one grand jury. And I was used to seeing none. Past several years, no heroin cases. Now there were a couple that were trickling into the office. To use 2008 as a baseline, we had 20 cases in our office in 2008 that was either possession or had something to do with heroin. Fast forward to last year, and out of those in 2008, really only 11 possession cases. Last year we had 212 possession cases, and there were 393 cases that had something to do with heroin. When I say had something to do with heroin, that's either possession, trafficking, distribution. That's property crimes where someone is stealing property, where someone's breaking into a house to steal property, to get money get money to buy drugs. These are violent cases where people have a heroin addiction, or there is some kind of, what Chris is seeing, some kind of drug war that is going on between two different sellers in the community. So to go from 20 cases in 2008 to almost 400 last year, and our numbers so far for 2014 are at 224 just for the first half of the year, with that being for the first half of the year 114 possession cases. So heroin is just like cocaine, crack was 10 years ago. Heroin has taken the place of the cocaine, and becoming a part of all crime that's happening in Jefferson County. That's what we're seeing. It's not just somebody possessing. And when I give you these numbers, this is just heroin. Okay? This is not all the other opioids, which we do see. We see people who have addictions and are using these. They are caught with them, driving on the street, what have you. We're seeing cases where people are breaking into homes to steal them, people are breaking into pharmacies to steal them, they're committing robberies of pharmacies to steal these opioids. Then they're turning around and selling those on the street. So when you heard Clay say $1 a milligram, well, that's an 80 milligram pill. So that's an $80 per pill on the street. And that's what they're getting for these. That's why they're so valuable to drug dealers. They can sell that, turn around, go back to a source. They're getting them from people who are not only stealing them, but forging prescriptions, going in, presenting a prescription to a pharmacy, just to turn that around, just to sell that on the street. And when you break that back down to presenting a case to a jury, it might just be a 1, 2, or 3 pill case where someone is in possession of that. But that represents a much broader spectrum there of what is actually happening in the community. And someone could look at it and say, well, it's just a pill, it's just a few pills of oxycodone. And they're not, it's difficult to make them see the entire problem that we're facing because of the opioids and now heroin.
So, Chief, you're known in this community for taking some very forward-leaning steps for law enforcement. The marches that you do to fight violence are well known. Seems like I may have even seen you a time or two suited up and going out on raids with your guys yourself to signify the importance of the work that you do. You've been here for a long time. You've seen different types of crime cycle through. How do you assess the significance of the heroin problem and the law enforcement reaction to it?
Well, let me start by saying thank you for inviting us to be a part, and for your leadership, and for all of our partners here on the panel with us. I would say right now, this is my 29th year of law enforcement, 3 different police departments. And so I would say at this point in time, heroin is the biggest challenge we're facing. And let me put it in perspective, and I think this will paint the picture for you. Up to this point, we have had in the city of Birmingham 21 criminal homicides. And out of the 21, 18 involved guns. Well, as of last week in the city of Birmingham, we've had about 20 heroin overdose deaths. So at this rate, our deaths from heroin overdoses is outnumbering our gun deaths in violent homicides. And I would say we never thought we would see that day. We don't know if that trend will continue. We hope it doesn't. But at this point, in the month of June, our overdose deaths are outpacing our criminal homicide gun deaths. And so we're seeing it on 2 perspectives. We're seeing it from a large organization perspective, and that's why our federal partners are so important to us. But we're also seeing it from a street level perspective. And by that I mean our patrol officers, the number of arrests that they are making, heroin-related arrests, has increased significantly over the last year. And so that means just a patrol officer out here stopping a car for speeding or running a red light, whatever the case might be, they are now running into heroin at a much greater frequency than ever before. And so as chief, that concerns us because, as the panel has so eloquently stated, where you find these drugs, quite often they're linked to all types of violence and all types of other criminal enterprises. And so we're seeing it from top to bottom in the Birmingham Police Department, on the streets of Birmingham. But let me also say that as a member of PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, a national organization of police chiefs who study different emerging issues, we just had a forum a few months ago that was solely focused on heroin. And so all across the nation, this heroin epidemic is affecting families, and there's a human cost, as we saw earlier and heard earlier. And so we have our hands full right now, but it's something we can't solve alone.
So I'm coming up on 24 years as a federal prosecutor in this district. And prior to this current spate of heroin cases that we've been looking at, I can really only remember a couple of heroin cases in our office, but I remember one very early in my career. I'd maybe been a federal prosecutor for 2 years, and I worked with the prosecutor who ran our drug unit. And we prosecuted, it was a small operation. It was 6 guys who were bringing in heroin in kilogram quantities, and I felt very good at the end of the day about the convictions in those cases, shutting down that heroin trafficking organization and getting those drugs off the street. But a lot has changed since those days. I noticed this morning, Clay, while we were sitting here, I got in my email DEA's threat assessment for drugs, talking about heroin as one of their top priorities and noting the skyrocketing death rates in some communities. They singled out Cleveland with a 400% increase in its death rate. And of course, we know here in Birmingham it exceeds that. It's about 450%. But against that law enforcement assessment, we also hear some voices saying law enforcement may not be the entire solution. Perhaps the war on drugs isn't a valid strategy. We even agree on this panel that we can't assess or we can't arrest our way out of the problem. So let me ask you all the hard question. Is there a role for law enforcement? Should we still be arresting and prosecuting drug dealers, or should we give up? Rick?
I think absolutely you've got to have a law enforcement response to this problem. You have to have that deterrent effect. It just can't be law enforcement only, because we can only impact the demand from one aspect, and that's at the supplier end of it, right? We can take out a source of supply, we can take out a local criminal enterprise, we might even get very lucky and take out a transnational criminal enterprise. But ultimately, that impact will be short-lived until the community starts saying enough, until people are educated and they quit using the drug that's killing so many of our young people. And it's got to be an all-of-community approach. We have here in Birmingham a pretty good all-of-law enforcement approach. State, local, federal, and international agencies all working together to address specific problems. And we've done that effectively here in Birmingham. And we did see, when we started this strategy, a sort of, first a downward tick in the number of overdose deaths, and then it sort of leveled out. But then it, 8 months later, it started to do what? Climb back up. So we took out those organizations and we created a vacuum for other traffickers to fill. But you have to have that deterrent impact. You've got to let people know that are going to try to profit from other people's misery by selling this poison, that you're there and that we're going to find you and that you're going to be incarcerated. So I think you have to do it, but it's not the complete answer to the problem.
Chief, other views?
No, I'm not contrary to his view, because I think law enforcement does have a role as first responders. And so whatever's occurring on the streets of whatever city you might live in, law enforcement has a role there. And so we have to continue that and make sure we have the resources and the partnerships, which we do have here in the Birmingham metro area, to continue to address the issue. There is a public health role, but there's a law enforcement role. And marrying the two together, I don't think we've been as successful in the past, but this type of forum is something that we can really build upon with some momentum and teamwork and collaboration as we go forward, to make sure those two entities and others are working hand in hand, because we can't do it alone, and I don't think public health can do it alone without us.
Clay, DEA has had some recent success, I think a pretty spectacular success, in identifying an individual who sold heroin that resulted in an overdose death and getting a federal judge to apply the 20-year mandatory minimum penalty for that. How does that sort of a case create deterrence, and what other thoughts do you have about the role of law enforcement?
Thank you. And that's what I wanted to briefly touch about, and I think Brandon can as well. When we talk about deterrence, we have to have a deterrent effect in the criminal enterprises within our city. And I can speak very directly to the defendant when he was told that he was just charged with distribution that resulted in death, and it is a minimum mandatory 20 years. There is no question that that got his attention, more so than any other time. He was a repeat offender. He was a career criminal. And we have, in Birmingham, we have a lot of career criminals, long-term family ties criminal organizations here. And they're used to making bond and getting out and getting arrested, making bond, getting out, and that cycle continues. Well, on this day for that particular defendant, that cycle ended. And he didn't walk the streets of Birmingham again, and he hasn't. When he was arrested that morning, he was not released pending trial, and he's now just pled guilty to 20 years because the evidence in that particular circumstance was overwhelming. It was overwhelming. He knew it was overwhelming. His defense counsel knew it was overwhelming. And certainly the DEA, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and Brandon and the chief here, we knew we had him. And there's a true deterrent effect to that particular scenario. And if we can carry those out on a strategic basis, I think that deterrent effect grows. Because the trafficker, the large-scale trafficker, he is aware of the FBI and the DEA and the techniques that we use to look at them from an international perspective and an organizational perspective. They're well aware of that. The guys on the street that the sergeant deals with every day and the chief deals with every day, they're not as well aware of that. But they are now. And that needs to continue to grow. Without any type of deterrent effect, crime would be rampant. And I think Brandon could shed some more light on that.
And Brandon, I wish you would shed light on that, as well as discussing, as we did in a conversation before the panel, what you think law enforcement needs from a community-wide approach in order to be fully successful.
The focus of law enforcement is I say threefold: punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation. Certainly with traffickers, people that are selling heroin, we want that punishment. When it comes down to someone that is possessing, despite what you might hear in different circles, Alabama Department of Corrections, for the entire Department of Corrections, is probably only about 12% of inmates who are in for either possession, distribution, or trafficking. So it's a relatively small number. I have a case in my office that we're handling right now, and it is the son of a friend who has been arrested before this occasion. This occasion, he was breaking into a family member's house to steal something, to buy heroin. And his dad called me and wanted him to stay in jail. He and his wife had a trip planned, and he felt like if his son got out before he got back from his trip, he was either going to be breaking into someone else's house, breaking into his dad's house, or he'd be dead. His son had gone through 5 rehabilitations, 2 court-ordered, if I remember correctly. I heard someone say earlier it can take 5 or 10 times to go through a rehabilitation program to get off heroin until, and hopefully stay off for the rest of your life. One thing that law enforcement and the courts can provide is that extra incentive to enter into a program, a court-ordered program, whether it be drug court or a task program. Foster Cook is here and he can speak to that. That you have that court-ordered part to say, listen, this is it. You don't have a choice here. Some people need that. That's partly deterrence. That's partly rehabilitation. But if you take away law enforcement from it totally, I don't think you'd be completely successful. Now, having said that, we aren't the best answer for this problem. The answer is before it gets to us. We are a lot of times just cleaning up the messes afterwards. it takes the entire community. It takes schools explaining to kids what's going to happen if they use something as bad as heroin. It takes the medical community being on their P's and Q's and watching what they're prescribing. It takes families seeing what is happening to their children, not being afraid to step in and save your child's life. That kind of sounds crazy, but you know what? Your child does not own anything. They don't own their room, they don't own their car, they don't own their school books, they don't own their book bag. Open it up. They probably don't own their computer. Look on it. See what they're doing. See who they're talking to. Talk to them about what they're experiencing in their life, and don't be afraid to just take it away from them. There's a lot of folks who wish they had done that before, and I'm here to tell you, I'm not going to arrest you. None of this panel is going to arrest you for getting involved in, in your child's eyes, screwing up their lives, but in your eyes, saving their life.
Clay?
I think one thing to bounce off what Brandon just said, and I'm really grateful for the MEMS and Ms. Bynum that were here, because we can talk to y'all till we're blue in the face, and we've done it. We've done it, Joyce and I and Rick, we've done it for now almost 2 years, and no one listens. But if you see the grief and the pain that the MEMS and those families who lost their children experience, even someone who is not involved in public health, law enforcement, rehabilitation, you can't tell me you wouldn't go out and have a holistic approach to help with that problem. I mean, most of us in this room are probably parents. I am a parent. I have a 13-year-old son. And if you don't think I'm not worried about him being exposed to a prescription pharmaceutical that could lead him to heroin one day, I absolutely am. And I deal with it every day. And he very clearly knows what will happen to him if I catch him. But we're not around our kids all the time, right? We're not. That's where it boils down to, I think, is law enforcement, is there an active role? Absolutely. Or crime runs amok. But we're all sitting there to tell you, as the heads of our respective agencies, and the man on the street fighting it every day with leading his guys in harm's way every day, we can't do it by ourselves, and we're asking for help.
So last question, Max has sort of given me the sign that I'm out of time. But Chief Roper, you've told me that there's been trouble building awareness in this community about the fact that heroin is back and it's a problem. Can you share your diagnosis of why you think it's been difficult to get the word out in this regard?
Extremely interesting question. And as we've looked at it from a department standpoint, heroin is a different type drug. It's not concentrated in one section of town. If I was having this challenge on the west side or the east side, people would accept the challenge more, I think. We could publicize it more and get more discussion, more collaboration. I think because of the footprints that heroin has taken and given, it's touching everywhere, and it's really hitting some families and some neighborhoods where heretofore may not have been challenged in that area. So I think we now have a greater shroud of secrecy regarding heroin and its impacts, because it is touching. It's not occurring on the street per se, in the areas that people would say, oh, that's the bad side of town. No one should have been there. Shouldn't have been over there. That's why that happened. No, it's affecting everyday America. It's affecting good people. It's affecting people who go to work every day, people who want to live the American dream. But with that comes some concern that some affected families, some affected communities don't want it publicized. So it becomes our secret. And when it becomes our secret, it's hard to get the help and the collaboration and partnerships that we need to address the issue, because we first have to identify there is a problem and confess that there is a problem, and then we try to get the resources to affect it. So we're seeing that having this forum and this room being full is absolutely amazing, and as Chief of Birmingham, I'm encouraged by it, because we really need your support, and we need you to be advocates in your world, in your circle, because you're in circles that we're not in. And so having you as our partners and having you pushing to address this issue will really give us some long-term residual effect that our community so desperately needs.
So I hate to have to stop this panel. I suspect that you all could go on and listen to them for a great deal longer. They have a lot of years of experience and insight, but I think this gives us a law enforcement baseline as we consider the community-wide work we need to do. And I'm going to go out on a ledge and probably get in trouble with my colleagues here, but I'm going to urge all of you as you go back to your groups, your schools, your communities, to feel like you can call on any of them to come and speak to your organization about heroin-related issues. They obviously are tremendously passionate. I've heard each of them do this work, and they will bring a great deal of information along with them. Am I in trouble for doing that, guys? Well, thank you very much. Appreciate your efforts to discuss a very serious topic with us. Thank you.